Father, we'll start at 6:30 exactly.
Yeah.
And then let everyone join as they will. Yeah?
Right.
Is that
Right.
okay? Yeah. Okay.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Steve is in Nashville, Tennessee. So I hope he can join us from there.
Yeah.
Oh, Father Paul is here. Good evening, Father. How are you?
Paul is here.
Hello, nice to see you.
Okay. I can't see him.
Can you see, Father? Can you see the screen?
He's not visible to me. Oh, your throat is troubling you.
Oh my God. It's a whole saga, Father, my throat. But it's getting better. I've had it attended to. It's better. It's a little long.
You should have a glass of warm water, keeps it.
Yeah, I have it here. Hopefully it'll not get. So I'm just going to check with Steve to make sure his link is working.
He's on the call.
He's here. Let me find him. I can't see him. Steve, can you hear me? I can't see him here.
I can't see him either.
Yeah. Yes, I'm here. Okay, Steve, I can't. There you are. Hi. Hi.
Okay, but
there you are, Steve. Hi.
Okay.
How is the audio and is it working? Yeah? Okay.
Yeah.
We'll take another 3 minutes and then we'll start.
Okay, I hear you perfectly. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, yeah, stunningly clear.
Great. Okay, super. All right, I'll just wait for a few minutes.
Yeah.
Steve, so the gentleman you just saw is the director of our campus in Delhi, Father Kasmir.
Hello, good evening. Great to have you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me, Director. Great to be here with you.
It must be morning for you or early morning?
That's right.
Okay.
It's 8 a.m., not too early. It's okay. It's great to be with you.
We're delighted to have you, that you could make the time to be here with us, to enlighten us.
Father, we're just waiting for the students. I think the students are coming on, but we'll start at 6:30.
Yeah, we'll start to bang on time.
Yeah, so they'll join because Steve, I've promised we'll release him in an hour.
Great.
So I'll stick to that promise. So, good evening, everyone. A very warm welcome to the Center for Policy at XLRI. I'm thrilled to have today with us my dear friend and also former colleague, Stephen Hill. Before I say a few more words about Steve, I'd like to have Father Kasmir welcome him. Father, over to you. Father, you're not audible.
Yeah.
Perfect. So,
So,
Father, over to you.
Yeah, so we are indeed delighted to welcome you, Mr. Stephen Hill, to this fourth lecture of our Global Policy Lecture Series. The Center for Policy was inaugurated in February of this year, and it is our endeavor to bring the finest minds from the world of policy and public affairs to share the experiences of the policymaking process in different spheres of life and the implications of those policies in the lives of people all over the world. We are grateful that you could make the time to speak to our students, staff, and faculty and nurture their knowledge on how policies are made and implemented, where and how they work, and in what manner they may fail to deliver a better prospect of life and livelihood all over the globe. The Center for Policy will be working on several pressing questions of the day. And so hearing from the experts like yourself would greatly benefit us all. Your accomplishments are too many, and Shobhana will share them in a moment. I would just like to mention that we are eager to learn about your experience of representing the United States government and its policies on the world stage. Your rich experience in facilitating process to bring peace to nations and pushing forward a robust human rights agenda serves as an example of the importance of the framing of solutions to global problems and following through on the successful implementation. So again, a very warm welcome to Mr. Stephen Hill to XLRA. We are deeply honored to have you and will listen with great care to the rich tapestry of the experience and wisdom that you will share with us this evening. It will enable us to keep global perspectives in mind as we train young students and scholars in achieving excellence in their learning of the importance of sound policies and the tremendous good that these can do in the world when they are framed within the context of ethics, integrity, equality, with the best outcomes for the recipients. With these thoughts, I now pass it over to you, Shobhana. Thank you.
Thank you, Father. It's actually quite a privilege for me to introduce Steve, someone I have known and worked with closely. He is a shining star, one of the brightest, sharpest legal minds in the US government. And he has been at the cutting edge of negotiating some of the most important agreements in the most difficult places on the planet. So I'll highlight a few things that he has done in the 2 decades that he has been with the State Department. He has just completed his tenure as Director for Global Criminal Justice at the National Security Council of the White House. Before that, for 6 years, he was Chief Legal Counsel at NATO, working with Secretary General Stoltenberg and Rasmussen. Some other highlights of Steve's work has been as counsel before the International Court of Justice and the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. He has been legal advisor at the US Embassy in Baghdad, chief US negotiator for the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. In addition to this practitioner's hat, Steve has also taught international law at the Hopkins Nanjing Center in China, the University of Oklahoma College of Law, and the George Mason University. He's also currently Associate Senior Policy Fellow at the Institute of Security and Global Affairs at Leiden University in the Netherlands. One quick personal note on Steve. You know, when I arrived and I was working with him in Kosovo, he was already a legend. And everybody said to me, you know, you will enjoy working with Steve Hill. I sat in on meetings with him and I thought, how does a young man like this be such an amazing negotiator for his government? And let me observe what are some of the things that he does, and he does so well that I can learn from. And watching Steve, what I learned as a professional were a few things which I think all of us can learn from. Intensive knowledge and preparation for whatever you're going into. Integrity, humility, a delicious sense of humor, but that didn't override the firmness of what he was there to do. Openness, persistence, and most importantly, deep sensitivity to the cultural context in which he was negotiating, sometimes very difficult agreements. I learned this from Steve, and I'm very grateful that he showed me the way. I could go on, but I let him speak. A quick note about our event today. So Steve will speak to us for about 30-35 minutes. And then we have both the campuses coming together today for the Q&A. We have Medha and Arjun from Delhi, and Bliss and Tejas from Jamshedpur. And I think we can continue to have this collaboration as we go forward. We'll then do a quick vote of thanks, and we won't keep Steve here more than we have to beyond an hour because he has things to do. So with great delight, I hand it over to you, Steve. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Father. Thank you very much, Shobana. I'm really honored by not only the invitation to be with you today, but also by the extremely kind words that you have just expressed. I'm very honored and humbled to be with you. I'm particularly delighted to be speaking to a group of people who are interested not only, of course, in public policy and international affairs, but also in the United Nations. Because as I hope to talk about today, the United Nations is, despite the challenges associated with it, more essential than ever. Father, before I start, can I just say that I really appreciated the framing that you provided to this meeting today. The values that you discussed, the values that you mentioned, and the values that I think motivate the work of XLRI are really key, I think, to success in any kind of public policy. The importance of an ethical approach, the importance of an approach that really keeps at the center the results that we're trying to achieve for real people. I think that kind of approach is one that will serve not only your students and your participants, but also the world. And it's one that I try to put in play in the work that I do, even though it is very difficult to do in practice, because sometimes when you're talking about international relations, it's on a very abstract level, the very big concepts that are difficult to see how they necessarily affect individuals, or how the massively huge concepts like peace and security, human rights, development, those are, by the way, the 3 pillars of the United Nations. It's hard to see how sometimes they can be translated into action. And that really is how I see the most important role of the United Nations, and that is to kind of take humanity's and humankind's best aspirations and try to help channel them into some kind of reality. So before I get into the substance of my talk, let me just tell you the personal bases on which I'm going to be talking to you today. My own interest in the United Nations is something that started when I was a student in, as we call it here in the United States, in high school, and also in university. I was very involved in Model United Nations. I'm not sure if that's something that some people on the phone might have participated in. That was really the activity that as a young person really started my passion, kindled it and nourished it to a kind of a flame that has been helping motivate me in more than 20 years that I've been working in this space of multilateralism. So I would say that it's very important to start thinking about these things when you are a student, or even when you're even in a teenager, because really the passion that's kindled there is something that will keep with you your entire life, and it'll help you through the inevitable disappointments, difficulties, and challenges that one encounters in a career. I was lucky enough that I was able to change from Model UN to Real UN, which is a transition that some people like to make, and it's not so easy. I had the honor as Shobana kindly stated, of working for my government, the United States government, in a variety of different multilateral institutions, but most prominently in the United Nations. And so when I started my career, after a couple of initial assignments, I was able to enter my dream assignment, which was working on different kinds of human rights issues in the United Nations system, in the General Assembly, in the Human Rights Council. I'll come back to these in a minute. I was working there as like a delegate. So, you know, like everything, the United Nations is composed of people, and people are the things that make the United Nations system run. I was working as one particular kind of role, which is a national representative. We'll come back to some of the other roles later. And in that case, I was trying to work to develop resolutions of the UN General Assembly, resolutions of the UN Security Council, and also programs of the UN that would help promote human rights and the rule of law. After working in Kosovo with Shobana and then going to China for 1 year, I had the honor of returning to New York as a member of our permanent mission to the United Nations. Every country has a permanent mission to the United Nations. Actually, the permanent mission of India is right around the corner from the permanent mission of the United States, so is very much our neighbor. And I worked there for 2.5 years. After spending 6 years in NATO, I then returned to Washington, D.C., where my job that I just concluded at the White House National Security Council had to do with the United Nations. And so the United Nations had been a real thread throughout my career. And so I thought what I would do today is try to update you on what the United States, my country, has been doing at the United Nations since the beginning of the President Biden's administration, which began, of course, in January of 2021. So I was working as part of President Biden's administration in the National Security Council from the spring of 2021 until just last week. So I should say, just before I get into the meat of what I'm doing, that I'm sharing with you, I'm not speaking as a current official, and I'm sharing with you my personal observations that are my personal views about the UN, but I think are of course, based on what I've been able to observe. Well, I mentioned that India and the US are kind of neighbors in terms of permanent missions in New York at the UN. But another thing that I can say about India and the US is that our two countries are both founding members of the UN, are both one of the original states that were at San Francisco in 1945, when the conference that developed the United Nations Charter happened. That was obviously right after the end of World War II. And the purpose of that conference in San Francisco was really to bring together the nations of the world at the time, there were around 50, to develop the architecture for what the world should look like after this terrible global conflict that was, of course, the second global conflict in the world at the beginning of the 20th century. And so the San Francisco conference was really the place where the aspirations of, as I said, humankind were really at their height. And part of the idea there was to try to put those inspirations into a structure, I use the word into an architecture, into a system that would enable those aspirations to start to shape reality. And that, in a way, is frankly the big challenge of the UN since that day in 1945, when the UN Charter was approved and eventually signed, to today, when the UN has grown from a little over 50 members to 193 members, when we've seen in the world so many different changes, so many conflicts, so much suffering, so many problems. But still, I think the UN lays at the center of trying to find a solution to this. and so I think that it's extremely important that everyone around the world, not just in my own country, but also in all countries, and especially in leading countries, I would say, of the international system, educates themselves as much as possible about the UN and the way in which it works. In this regard, India plays a crucial role. India not only being a founding member, of course, even before independence of India. India is one of the countries that served the most on the UN Security Council, 8 times on the UN Security Council, including right now, actually as a non-permanent, so-called non-permanent member or an elected member of the UN Security Council, 8 times. India was the home of the first woman to be the president of the UN General Assembly, already back in the 1950s, which is saying, considering which is saying a lot, and is such an important leadership. Also, many Indian nationals, serve within the UN system as high officials, as the people who get the work done in the system, and also, of course, in the peacekeeping of the UN, which is very important. So I think it's very important that our 2 countries continue to work together with all of our partners around the world to try to tackle the problem. So let me get into what I wanted to talk to you today, which is kind of how does the Biden-Harris administration, and I didn't even realize it till just now, but I have my coffee cup here. How does the Biden-Harris administration look at the multilateral system? Of course, the administration took office after the previous administration, which had a rather different approach to the United Nations and to the multilateral system. As a result, strengthening the multilateral system was really a top priority for President Biden. He pledged during the campaign, when he was a candidate for president, to recommit the country to multilateralism. That's a kind of it's a good sounding phrase, especially if you're a person who likes multilateral institutions like me. But what does that mean? And, why is that important? I was mentioning before the many challenges facing the world at the moment. I hardly need to elaborate them here. But of course, we have the pandemic. We have the real peril in which the global climate, finds itself. We have authoritarian governments around the world that are chipping away at the gains in terms of democracy that have been made, and even deeply held principles that appeared in the UN Charter 1945 and that have been really the foundation of the global architecture, including the territorial integrity of states, are under threat. And these are very grave challenges. And I think one thing that we have to realize, just speaking from the United States perspective, but I think it also applies to other large countries like India, is that no one country, no matter how powerful, can really solve these and address these solutions alone. We need the help of allies, partners, and the multilateral system to overcome them. One particularity, I think, of the US approach traditionally to the UN is this somewhat complicated feeling about the United Nations system. And so even as a founding member of the UN, even as a member of the permanent 5, the P5 of the Security Council, there has been a real vivid domestic debate in our country about kind of the value of the UN and the relationship between the United Nations and also just kind of global governance more broadly, and our own sovereignty, our own democracy. And I think that one thing that we've been trying to emphasize in this new administration is that, our country's interests are strengthened. They're not threatened by working with other countries in places like the United Nations. And so we have to see the United Nations really as a way to strengthen the democracy, the sovereignty of states, in a way to multiply that in a way throughout, to strengthen our countries rather than to weaken them. And I think that's kind of the overall philosophy. Let me tell you about a couple of the things that we've been actually doing at the UN since last spring in different areas. And I'm just going to kind of mention these things just as almost like current events, so that maybe they can, if you're interested in specific areas, substantive areas, we can talk about them later. So on the first day when President Biden took office back in 2021, he rescinded or canceled the previous administration's decision to withdraw from the World Health Organization. And that was very important because obviously the pandemic was raging. The World Health Organization was really at the center of the global response to the pandemic, and was very important in terms of being a place where nations can coordinate their policies, where nations can discuss pandemic response. And so we really needed to get back into that organization that the previous administration had taken the United States out of, even if there are some concerns about the efficiency, the leadership of the organization. We thought it was right to get back into the table or into the room, because, regardless of how big your country is, if you are not at the table, you're not part of the conversation. In addition to the WHO, World Health Organization, the US rejoined the Paris Climate Accords, which it had pulled out of under the previous administration. Those have to do with reducing carbon output. You may be familiar with the Paris Climate Accord. Similarly, the United States rejoined the UN Human Rights Council, ran for election to that. The previous administration had actually withdrawn the country from the UN Human Rights Council, and the US sought re-election and has, since the beginning of this year, 2022, now been a member of the Human Rights Council, and it's paid off in many different ways. For example, the Human Rights Council was just able to, last week, able to create a special expert position to look into the serious situation of human rights in the Russian Federation. The Human Rights Council also heard about a very serious report by the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights about the very serious human rights violations against the Uyghur population in Xinjiang, in China, and hopefully we'll be able to follow up on this report later. Another issue that I wanted to advance, because maybe not so much in the international news like those other issues, is that we've really been trying to link up, and I think this is something that's maybe an innovation and a novel thing with this administration. We've really been trying to link up what we're doing and the problems and challenges that we have at the domestic level in our country with what we're doing at the international level. So let me explain what I mean by that. So we've really been trying to take head on the issue of racial inequality and injustice in the United States. We've really been trying to take that up at the UN in the context of the fight against racial discrimination and the global fight against or for racial equality and justice. And that's an area that I think India has a very proud history of working on in the United Nations system. And so we're trying to take a bit of a different approach, which is, not fighting for principles, but also saying that, we are not only applying these principles to other people, to other countries. It's not just an outbound push. It is something that we are trying to do for ourselves. And that requires something that I think both Father and Shobana mentioned in their introduction, which is the issue of humility and the issue of approaching things in a humble manner, recognizing that, in our case, our own country's struggles should help inform what we're doing. And so what does this mean practically? Well, for the first time ever, the United States issued a standing invitation 2 UN experts. So I was saying that the UN just established an expert about the human rights situation in the US. There are actually UN experts on a lot of different issues, including racism, including police brutality, structural racism in the police context. The United States issued for the first time ever a standing invitation to the UN to send those experts to our country and to look into what they find and then deliver a public report. We had never done that before. It takes some, I would say, it's not so easy politically. We also, like India, have a federal system where we have the federal government, we have states. The states are not always, they don't really deal with the UN on a daily basis. So it's challenging to have UN experts come and talk to the states. And so it'll be a lot of work, but we think that this is how states should really approach the United Nations. Let me just mention a couple of other things before I move to the Security Council. And I think this is a specific issue that's of interest in India. On the humanitarian front, we've really focused on trying to provide humanitarian assistance to Syrian people. We have been dealing since last year with Russia within the Security Council to work on a resolution that authorizes the aid across the Turkish border. It's been very challenging, but we've had some accomplishments together with our partners. And then also maybe closer to India, the issue of Afghanistan and how the international community should respond after the tragic Taliban takeover there. Not only is the UN system providing assistance, but the UN Security Council really acted quickly to demand that the Taliban fulfill their commitments to respect the rights of Afghan women and girls and to allow the UN to keep providing humanitarian assistance that's so badly needed in Afghanistan. I want to mention, I've talked about things that have been happening a lot in 2021, but the major change in 2022 was, of course, Russia's aggression against Ukraine. Its further invasion of Ukraine that was building on Russia's invasion of Crimea in 2014 and is obviously still ongoing. We have really put the UN at the center of the global response to Russia's actions. And why is that the case? Well, it's not that Russia's aggression is kind of a new Cold War or a new issue that only concerns kind of the United States and Europe versus Russia with Ukraine, the unfortunate victim in the middle. In fact, it's really an issue that should concern all countries. It's really tests the fundamental principles that the UN was founded on, namely that aggression is never acceptable, and that the territorial integrity of states is of prime importance. Also, if you look at the human rights impact of Russia's aggression, the importance of human rights there. Now, of course, Russia is a permanent member of the Security Council and thus has the veto power. I haven't really talked about the basic architecture of the UN, but I think that you're probably familiar with it. Russia vetoed the attempts to bring resolutions in the Security Council about its activities, not only at the beginning of the invasion back in February, March, but also just recently when the Security Council tried to pass a resolution about the attempted annexations, these illegal annexations of territories in eastern Ukraine, which is totally unacceptable. Russia used its veto power to block that. And so what did the United States with its allies and partners do? We went to the General Assembly, which is one of the other principal organs of the United Nations, and advocated for the adoption of a series of resolutions starting in March, but also just culminating last week, expressing, the view of large part of the international community that Russia's actions are unacceptable. So we have the voting numbers are quite interesting, but there was a vote, for example, in earlier in the spring where 141 countries condemned Russia's invasion of Ukraine, with quite a number of countries abstaining from that vote. And then just last week, 143 countries condemned the attempted annexations of those territories, with, again, many, many states abstaining and only a few voting against. So, this is about defending the UN Charter. As we go forward, as the UN, goes beyond its 77th anniversary, which is actually going to happen quite soon, towards the future. And, people ask, will the US use the UN Charter when it serves us and then abandon it when it doesn't? You could call that kind of question sort of, is there hypocrisy about the US approach to the UN? And so we've tried to tackle that question, which is, a question that a lot of people ask. Maybe some people on this call are thinking about that question. We've tried to, tackle that issue head on by, and in a way that the US has really never done before. And so when President Biden went to the United Nations a few weeks ago in September to make his annual address together with the other heads of state and government of the world at the General Assembly, he talked about a few things. And I want to go through, just to conclude this part of the presentation and then go on to your questions. I want to go through 6 different principles that the new administration is trying to advance and has adopted in terms of the way that the US will conduct itself at the United Nations for the future. So these are actually quite new. They were only really announced in President Biden's speech a couple of weeks ago, and then they were kind of elaborated on in a speech in September by our ambassador to the United Nations, Mrs. Linda Thomas Greenfield, a speech that she actually made in San Francisco, which is where the UN Charter, as we were talking about, was negotiated. So let me just run through these 6 principles here, and then we can move to the question period. So first principle, we pledge to defend and act strictly in accordance with the UN Charter. And so nobody, including United States, can claim a perfect record about this since the beginning of the UN. But this exceptional moment, really calls for much more leadership by our countries in terms of defending the Charter. And we will do this, to help strengthen the UN membership's faith and adherence to the UN Charter, despite what countries like Russia have been doing. Second principle, we, United States, will work pragmatically with all Security Council members and all, by extension with UN members to address threats to international peace and security. We can't let bilateral disputes become an excuse for obstructing the Security Council's mandate or so he's obstructing the Security Council's mandate. I want to highlight that despite the high level of disagreement that we have with what Russia is doing and the disagreements that we have with China, for example, on a host of issues, we still need to work together in the UN to make progress on many issues, including kind of just the day-to-day work of the UN, but also tackling bigger problems like climate change. Third, and this is probably one of the more historical announcements that's been made, the US will refrain from the use of the veto except in rare and extraordinary situations. And in particular, for the first time ever, the US, together with the UK and France, amongst the permanent members of the Security Council, joined an initiative that was brought by Liechtenstein and a number of other countries in the General Assembly to require any permanent member of the Security Council that exercises its veto to then go to the General Assembly and explain that to the broader membership of the UN, explain why they use the veto. That had never happened before, never been a requirement. And it's something that we, the United States, got on board with because we thought that it is important to have accountability and to maintain a broader responsibility towards the entire UN membership. So the United States will refrain from the use of the veto except in rare and extraordinary situations. Fourth principle, almost done here. We will redouble our efforts to defend human rights and fundamental freedoms in the United Nations system. I was talking about the United Nations Human Rights Council, but we will put human rights more at the center of what we're doing in the UN, and we can talk about that later if you're interested. Fifth principle, we will enhance cooperation, inclusivity, and transparency. So what does that mean? That means that when we work in the Security Council, there are only 15 states in the Security Council, of course. We will work better together with the General Assembly, which represents the entire UN membership, with all of the different regional groups and with a cross-section of UN member states. And I think that, you know, India is extremely important given India's leadership in the broader United Nations community in this regard. And then finally, and perhaps very relevant for an Indian audience, President Biden announced that we will advance efforts to reform the United Nations Security Council. Now, the US has always been in favor of reform of the Security Council. The Security Council has only been expanded once back in the 1960s to take into account of the more members that joined the UN since 1945. But the issue of Security Council reform has essentially been paralyzed ever since. If you've studied Security Council reform, you know that there are a number of different proposals out there for expanding different, number of permanent seats. India is often one of the countries that's discussed in that regard to become a permanent member of the Security Council. So we will advance efforts to reform the UN Security Council. And we do believe that the Security Council should better reflect the current global realities. It should have more geographically diverse perspectives. And as President Biden said at the General Assembly in September, we will continue to support all of the countries for permanent membership that we've already supported. That includes India, but we will also try to expand that list to other areas. So just to sum up, I've tried to give you a sense of the new approach that this new-ish administration has been trying to make to the UN. And I think it's grounded in many of the principles that we heard about at the beginning of this discussion, namely a humble approach, a recognition that nobody, no country, regardless of size, can tackle these problems alone. The desire to defend an architecture that, despite its many shortcomings and problems, has actually served the world solidly over the past more than 70 years, to try to preserve it for the future and preserve it in the face of a kind of considerable threat to that architecture that's posed by some countries in the world. And to do this all together with, not just countries from, the global north, but the whole UN membership. And so that's why I kind of wanted to lay that out. I wanted to say that, from my own personal perspective, many of the things that the United Nations has actually done in the last since the beginning of this year are things that I had never imagined that the UN would be able to do. And so, for example, I talked about how after Russia's veto in the Security Council back in the spring, the many UN member states invoked this precedent that's called the the Uniting for Peace resolution, which is something that was from the 1950s and really was not very often used. And that says that, if the Security Council has failed to act, the General Assembly should act. I never thought that would be used, and it was invoked and used. The different kinds of ways in which we can use the UN system are things that when I was a student in Model UN back in high school and in university, I learned about, but never really thought would be possible. And so just to conclude, I would say that if you're interested in the United Nations system, it really pays to study the way in which the United Nations system works and the mechanics of it. Because sometimes, and maybe it takes an unprecedented crisis like we're going through in the world now, or unprecedented crises, sometimes you can actually use things that you learned about in school and everybody else said, well, that's never going to happen, or that's never going to be possible. But sometimes they are needed, and that kind of creativity is actually needed. So I don't know if Shobana, should I hand the floor back to you for the Q&A? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. This is so encouraging to hear, because a decade and a half ago when I was at the UN, the bureaucracy itself was frightening enough that I fled out of the system. So the fact that it's on its way to a fitter and more useful system is very encouraging news. So what we did with the Q&A, with the questions, Steve, is we collated questions from the audience, which the 4 students already have with them. And so can I call Medha Arjun from Delhi and Bliss and Tejas to then take over and please do the Q&A. Thank you.
Sure, ma'am. Thank you. So, Stephen, the first question that we have is kind of an opinion question from you. For you, is that like India has always maintained a stance of taking no sides in any game. Like even in the Ukraine crisis, India did not clearly bash Russia or didn't support the Ukrainians as well. They tried to play both the games. So what do you feel as an expert negotiator and a person who has seen a lot of international tussles being handled? So what do you think a country's stance should be? Should it be trying to balance both ends, or should it be something very direct that they support one country, because that really might not hedge bets enough?
Okay, we'll do each question and then, okay, well, just briefly. Well, I think it's a great question, and thank you for bringing that up about, I was discussing the voting in the General Assembly and also in Security Council, as a matter of fact, where India and, other countries abstained on these resolutions. I mean, I think it's really key to have as strong a message from the global community as possible. That means also listening to the concerns that are expressed by different members of the global community. And so I know that in the context of India, there were some different considerations. There were some special considerations. Like I remember in the spring, India mentioned the plight of the Indian students who were trapped effectively because of Russia's actions in Ukraine. And it's very important to to listen to those concerns seriously and to take them into strong consideration. So one thing that I would say is that I would look at this issue of yes votes, abstentions, etc. More as more in a bigger picture, which is that what those resolutions actually show is that so few countries, like I think only 5 countries or something, voted against these resolutions. I mean, including Russia. That's a huge statement by the international community. And so, it's hard to say in any context, as you were saying, should a country take a clear stand or should it balance? I mean, every country has to balance. But what I would say is that, we can also read between the lines, if you will, and that countries are taking strong stances, and it's important to continue doing that. And I think that that's something that India can also contribute in taking a strong stance. Thank you. I don't know, should we not, we have another question from you, or no, from Delhi, or we go to a different?
Yeah, we have Delhi, Jamshedpur. We have 2 campuses, Steve. So so we're going to Delhi and then over to Jamshedpur.
Yeah, so I have another question. So what do you find to be the most challenging aspect of working in international law?
Thank you very much. What I find to be the most challenging aspect is that you really need to listen to others to try to understand where they are coming from. Because, you know, unlike the domestic legal system, you know, where you have a very clear kind of authority, you know, the state or the judicial system, et cetera. The international system is obviously really, you know, in a way lacking that, even if I've been talking about the Security Council and its legally binding Chapter 7 resolutions. I mean, the fact is that the enforcement and international system is you know, lacking, or is at least different from how it is in the domestic system. So that means that you need to really rely, I think, on a much more nuanced approach to dealing with problems. You have to try to understand more where the other side is coming from. You can't just kind of, people don't have the same shared kind of understanding of the rules that you have in a national system. Of course, there are of course foundational rules in international law, but the same sort of cultural and socio kind of cultural understanding that underpins, you know, the rule of law in a domestic context is different in the international context. And so what I find, just like as an actual international lawyer, is that you really need to spend more time understanding where the other side is coming from. And that means, you know, listening to people. That means that, but not just listening, but like trying to figure out what exactly is motivating them. And dialoguing with them and making sure that you you kind of try to understand the root causes of what someone is actually arguing for. You don't really need to do that if you're a lawyer. I mean, in a domestic court, right? Really. But you definitely do need to do that as an international lawyer. And it's really challenging because obviously you have cultural differences, you have differences of self-interest or national interest. You have, you know, language barriers. You have the issue of different, you know, legal systems, the civil law system versus the common law system. But as we know, you know, even the differences amongst the common law system, like India, US legal system, I mean, even if they are common law systems, they're obviously very different. And how does that inform the way in which people understand international you know, international concepts. The other thing that I find is that it's important to understand a little bit about the kind of legal systems of different states. You obviously can't be an expert in the legal system of well, certainly not all states, but even of other states. But, you know, especially for large states like the US, India, that have a kind of like, you know, rather complex governmental system, it's important to try to understand how those systems work in order to understand how international law can work. You know, I was talking a little bit in the context of human rights, how it's very challenging for the US sometimes to implement human rights issues because, you know, it's really the federal government that's in charge of international law implementation and obligations, whilst the state governments, you know, they should also take these things into account, but they're just not really like interfacing directly with the international system. And a lot of the human rights challenges that you have are happening really at the state and local level, just by nature of the fact that's where the people are. And so sometimes understanding other government structures is really important, but that's obviously not that easy. So there's just a few things that I find challenging, but it kind of boils down to this issue of being a kind of an active listener and an active, someone who's trying to actively understand. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can we have Arjun? Would you like to take the next one?
Yeah, I'll do that. Hi, Stephen. We've talked about climate change, and it's going to be at a large scale. Different countries are going to get affected, and one of the implications of this is a lot of migration is happening because of this. So, how does UN as an umbrella organization looks to address this, especially the human right aspect and the legal aspect regarding this?
Well, I think that's a great question about the the migration impacts of climate change. And that's something that we've actually been trying to tackle from the US side in our own policymaking in the new administration, is to try to figure out what does it mean also for our country, bearing in mind that we're not the first country that folks who are fleeing climate change are necessarily going to end up in, although maybe they may, but it's something that affects many other countries, around the world. Yeah, how can the UN deal with that? Well, first of all, I think that the UN is really the international community's primary point of coordination for migration issues. So there's a part of the UN system called the International Organization of Migration that helps try to coordinate help to countries who are receiving people, including people who are migrating because of climate change related issues. So I think to try to strengthen those institutions is very important. It's obviously the receiving countries need to be supported as much as possible, and so in order to try to make that possible, you need to make sure that you have some kind of international mechanism for getting help to those countries and to those people. And so that is of course, the IOM, that is the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. I mean, that's what the United Nations does. And so I think part of it is trying to make sure that more funding goes to those organizations. So that's something that we're working with our Congress on. For example, from the US perspective, also providing them with more political support. I mean, I've been talking about the real, political elements of the UN, the General Assembly, the Security Council, but so much of the UN is actually the kind of work that the UN bodies, the agencies, are actually doing on the ground with people. And instead of, withdrawing from those agencies or cutting their funding, I think we need to be increasing our support, getting more into them and doubling down more. So I think that it's something that we are definitely, from the US perspective, trying to help with. Of course, it's really the countries that are receiving the migrants that are bearing the greatest brunt of this terrible burden. And of course, also the migrants themselves are often in very dire situations. And so I think we have to also keep in mind whom are we trying to help here? Who are we trying to? What's the focus of our activities? And I think that's extremely important. So that's definitely an element of the whole climate change problem that's going to become more and more important. So insofar as you are focusing on international and national responses, I think that's very important. Thank you.
Bliss, would you like to go ahead? I think you guys can take the questions without my intervening. Is Bliss here or not?
I see her.
Bliss, yeah. Can you unmute? You're not able to unmute? Kirti, if you're there. You should be able to unmute because you're one of the speakers here.
Yes. Hello, Steve. It was a very insightful conversation with you. So my question for you would be, UN is a global body and the policies get formed at a central level. But during an implementation, like you mentioned, the body faced various resistance from the different countries on a political, geographical, and cultural context. Wouldn't it be more appropriate to have a more region culture-based organization or sub-organization rather than a large body which can really focus on specialized problems?
Yeah, well, first of all, Bliss, I'm glad you unmuted because that's an amazing question, and I think that that actually is one of the key issues. I mean, I guess the way I would tackle that is to say that yes, it would be the case, but luckily in a lot of regions we have that, the kind of regional approach, but on the other hand, in other regions we don't have that. And then, so let me talk about kind of the positive part of it as far as I'm concerned, and then I'll talk about some, maybe like the challenges. So the positive angle is that in some regions there is a strong regional architecture. So I'm just thinking about like Africa, the African Union. That is a clear kind of regional body that I know African countries, but also many other countries, including my own, are trying to do their best to strengthen and make sure that the African Union is as capable and able to address, as many problems as possible, not just kind of peace and security problems, of which there are many, unfortunately, on the African continent, but also human rights and development. Those are the three pillars of the UN system, and they're all obviously interlinked: development, human rights, peace, and security. So that is sort of a positive thing. So the UN and the African Union are working quite closely. For example, peacekeeping missions, strengthening the African Union's capacities. So that's a kind of like, I hope, a success story for the future. And that's where I totally agree with you that we need to really double down on that. Other regions, you either have such a kind of an entity, and maybe it's not that strong, or you don't have an entity that's really regional in nature, or that's kind of like broadly regional. So I'm just thinking about like Asian countries, Asia Pacific states. You have certain sub-regions that have strong institutions like ASEAN in Southeast Asia, but you don't have kind of broad regional organizations necessarily. I think that also one of the so that's a big challenge. The other problem is that, the UN, and this is something that I hope the UN can kind of like work on, and it's something we're trying to grapple with a little bit, is that, the UN is traditionally divided into these like different regional groups. There's the Western states, there's the Eastern European, which is kind of reflecting the Cold War issues. There's a very big, there's African countries, there's a very big Asian Pacific group. But the fact is, so many problems are kind of trans-regional, or, I mean, they're global, but they're also trans-regional. And so just thinking about Europe, the Western group and the Eastern European group are kind of really relics of the Cold War. And there are many countries within the Eastern European group that are really aligned with countries in the Western group politically. So unfortunately, that sort of regional art thing is a little bit baked into the UN system and baked into the UN Charter, and maybe difficult to change. That's why I was saying, when I was describing our new approach, including these 6 principles, that we need to work more cross-regionally. And what is, so in other words, for example, the Ukraine situation, what Russia has done is really not just affected that area, but because of the food prices, because of oil issues, a lot of supply chain, impacts, it affects kind of everyone. And so I think we need to build more cross-regional initiatives. That's obviously where India, I think, is such an important player. Is very involved in these kind of different new formations. For example, there's the Quad, which is, there's the whole Indo-Pacific strategy, which is a bit sort of a little bit different than just the Pacific as you look at it traditionally. So, I think your question is kind of like both one of kind of the architecture, but it's also a strategic question. And I think it's one that definitely we have to tackle, where by making architectural changes where it's possible, working together more as the Quad, for example, but also just working more together with different kinds of partners, and partners that, span both developing countries and other countries that try to take a more a different and more innovative approach to working together. So thank you very much for your question, Bliss.
So Steve, we've reached 7:30 exactly, and I think I'm going to let you go because I know you have an important errand to run. Thank you so very much. I'm personally thrilled because I haven't seen you in ages, but that's going to change soon because I'm coming to the US.
Perfect.
For a visit, but thank you for being here. Come to XLRI, see our center, meet some kids who couldn't be here today because of class, would love to see you in person. So we'll plan that one of these days. So I want to thank you most of all to the participants for being here, and to Father Casimir and the other officials present from XLRI. It's been a great evening listening to you, and hopefully we'll have more such evenings with you, Steve.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. It's wonderful to see you too, Shobana, Father, and also everybody who's participating. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I hope you have a wonderful evening. Our day is just starting here in Nashville, Tennessee, United States. So hopefully I will have a productive day. And thanks for taking the time.
And our best to Mom. I hope she gets well soon. Give her a love. Okay, Steve. Thanks so much. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.